Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 148 for the 18th of Nissan in a leap year. It is the third day of Pesach, of Passover, so happy Pesach. And I just finished listening to the audiobook, The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung, for those of you who are familiar, which is what gave me the inspiration to call this episode The Selfless Self, and to just talk about that for a moment. So the main premise that Carl Jung was, of course, the famous psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, great thinker, really big minds in the world of psychology in specific. And so he, in this book, The Undiscovered Self, he really talks about how there is the biggest danger to mankind is in abdicating the sense of individuality, of the sense of not being in touch with our own sense of self, and instead abdicating that over in favor of the collective, of the state, of the government, of even maybe the church, or some even like institution like that. And he said that these collective institutions, what they do is they kind of deny the nature of the individual, both in terms of the good of the individual as well as in terms of the bad that resides inside the individual. So this is where you get like these tribal groups that see the other as the enemy and the other as evil because they're incapable of seeing the evil within themselves. And Carl Jung argued that the remedy for all of this, and really the only way that salvation will come to mankind, is if we really bring that focal point back to the individual, to each individual person, and for each individual person to recognize both the evil that exists within themselves as well as the good that exists within themselves. So I thought this was very interesting in light of Tanya in general, which talks, as we've been learning, about how every single one of us has both evil within ourselves, which we've called the animal soul. And then we also have tremendous good within ourselves, which we've called the godly soul. So why am I bringing all of this up? Well, so we're still in the middle of chapter 41. Today, we're actually going to conclude chapter 41. And while Carl Jung made a lot of emphasis on really recognizing the innate evil that we all have and learning how to cope with this innate evil, and the Tanya does so as well. We did talk about the animal soul at length. Today, the focus is actually going to be in the other extreme, is about really getting in tune with our godly soul, our godly nature, which in other words, we can call it to be synonymous with the selfless nature of who we are. And the reason why we're going to be talking about this is because we're seeing that throughout this chapter, the Alter Rebbe is really giving us a very, very, very high standard in terms of how we should be relating to God and how our godly religious service should be. Namely, that the way that we relate to God and the way that we relate to our Judaism and our spiritual service needs to be one of really total selfless service, like self-abnegation in its entirety. We've really been talking about this. Yesterday, we talked about the idea of like trying to tap into the energies that are at play throughout the world, throughout the day, like the different vitalizing forces that come into play throughout the day. And so really, it does sound like this ideal is to have this live a life of selflessness. And this seems really like a very, very high bar. And it seems like something that isn't necessarily very attainable, because the Alter Rebbe even himself mentioned that the only way to truly attain this is by getting to a certain level of very high love of God. And how many of us can honestly say that we have that sense of love of God that's on such a high level that makes us love God more than we love ourselves? So what we'll learn about today is that the Alter Rebbe is giving us some encouragement. And he's telling us that, in fact, we all do have this. We have this innately, just like Carl Jung was saying, that we really need to get in touch with the undiscovered self, with who we really are. The Alter Rebbe today is teaching us that every single one of us has a godly soul. And this godly soul actually does want to be selfless, does want to be consumed in God totally, not even for its own sake, not because it's looking to have this like spiritual experience of like, self-annihilation or anything like that, but it's truly, truly selfless. And it truly wants to do what God asks of us to do. And then the Alter Rebbe will conclude and talk about how not only is this its nature, so then we might say like, okay, so this is our nature, so we don't really have to worry about it. We can just go through our lives and rely on this innate nature that we have as Jews, this that we were gifted with. But the Alter Rebbe says, nevertheless, we should strive to get to this higher level of coming to a conscious awakening, a conscious understanding of what's going on. Just like, again, lahavdil, to bring it back to Carl Jung's remedy for the salvation of the world is not to just sit back and be okay with accepting the fact that we have these like instincts and these shadows within ourselves, as he calls them, but rather we should try to become as conscious of them as possible. And that's where the salvation will come. So in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains it thus, that while we do all have this innate natural love, our mission in life is really to try to make this innate love as conscious as possible by really taking the time to meditate intellectually and think about God in a real way. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. So the Alter Rebbe says that here, his entire intention of self-sacrificing his life to God through his Torah and through his prayer to raise up this spark of godliness that is inside of him in the godly soul to its source should be just in order to give Hashem nachas, in order to bring God pleasure. Like, for example, when we talk about the joy of a king, when his son comes to him, when his only son comes to him out of captivity. So let's say you had a prince who is in captivity, and then the prince comes back and comes out of jail and goes back to the father. So just imagine the great joy that the king will have upon seeing the son that was held in captivity. This is similar to, this is likened to the joy that God will have when this godly soul returns back to him. And now the Alter Rebbe says that this intention is true truth. It's totally authentic, completely in every single Jewish person at any moment and any time, since they have this innate natural love, since we all have this innate natural love that was given to us as an inheritance from our forefathers. However, the Alter Rebbe concludes here, and he says, we still do need to set aside specific times to meditate upon the greatness of God, to try to understand to the best of our ability and cultivate this fear and love of God in an intellectual way. And perhaps through this meditation and contemplation, we will come to this deeper sense of God that's not just like this innate love and fear of God, but we'll come to this higher level of God that it stems from intellectual pursuits, but then does result in a more passionate type of love of God, as we already talked about previously in previous episodes. So that is it for today. And so we've concluded chapter 41. And so just in conclusion, just to bring it back to what we were talking about, the undiscovered self, the selfless self. So Carl Jung really focuses more on the negative aspects of the self, at least in that book. I'm not an expert in Carl Jung at this point, but the Alter Rebbe is telling us that we should really focus in on the positive aspects of ourselves, at least at this moment, in terms of trying to develop this selfless relationship with God and trying to have our service be one that is really selfless, to the point that it's not only about having our godly soul expire within God because it feels good for the godly soul to do this, but to be truly selfless in the sense that we're doing it for God's sake because we know how much joy it brings to the King. And this is something that we all innately have, and it's just about really awakening it within ourselves and becoming aware of it. And not only that, but we shouldn't just suffice with this innate love, but we should also try to cultivate a more intellectual and meditative type of love and use our minds to the best of our ability to try to understand God so we can deepen in our relationship with him. And this will be elaborated upon further. So that's it for today, and we will continue tomorrow when we begin chapter 42. I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.